The wind keened through the pines like a distant voice calling for help. Snow fell thick and heavy, covering the forest floor in a pristine white hush. Paul Granger stood at the edge of a half-frozen creek, breath catching in his throat, as he caught sight of something dark against the snow. It was a German shepherd, its fur matted with ice, muzzle dusted with frost. The poor creature was hardly moving. Paul's heart lurched. He'd come to these woods to find some measure of peace after a year of personal upheaval. But this was no peaceful scene. One trembling front paw stretched toward him as though pleading for rescue. The dog's eyes, still bright behind the glaze of cold, locked onto Paul's, and for an instant it felt like a silent entreaty. "Don't leave me here, please." Snow gathered on Paul's shoulders. The frigid air seared his lungs, yet the dog's faint whine cut through all his own despair, demanding he do something. As Paul took a step closer, he realized this moment would define his entire winter, maybe his entire life. He bent down, heart racing, desperate to save this living soul trapped in the icy wilderness. Paul Granger had fled to these remote woods of northern Minnesota to escape the memories that haunted him like shadows. 41 years old, with streaks of gray in his dark hair, he had once been a dedicated civil engineer, a man who helped raise cities from the ground up. But a series of personal tragedies over the past year had eroded the foundation of his life. First came his mother's passing, then a divorce that left his suburban home a hollow shell. Worn down by grief and loss, Paul found he could no longer face the daily grind of life in a bustling city. So he'd bought a modest cabin near the edge of the Chippewa National Forest. It was rugged country, vast stands of pine and birch, dozens of hidden lakes glittering like shards of glass when the sun peeked through the endless canopy. In winter, the snowfall blanketed the land so completely that it felt like stepping into another world. And that was precisely what Paul craved. Another world, free of memories, free of heartbreak. He spent his days now walking the frozen trails, boots crunching over layers of packed snow, pausing at the occasional animal track or beaver dam. He relished the stillness, found comfort in the hush that enveloped the land whenever a storm rolled in. The only company he had was the plaintive call of far-off owls and the sigh of wind through the towering pines. Despite the quiet, though, Paul's mind would not stop churning. In the darkness, nightmares of his mother's last days often woke him, her labored breathing echoing in his ears. His ex-wife's parting words haunted him too. "You're too closed off, Paul. You run at the first sign of trouble." He had run, straight into the arms of this frozen wilderness, believing it might cradle his battered soul and help him start over. But he hadn't expected a moment like this morning's discovery. With the dog lying in the snow, half dead, his own sadness and regrets momentarily vanished, replaced by a singular, urgent need to act. This place might have been harsh and unforgiving in winter, but it was also a land of survival. And perhaps, in helping the dog survive, Paul would begin to learn what it meant for him to survive too. He hauled up the heavy lumps of kindling each night to feed the cast-iron stove. He scattered seed for the jays. He read old survival handbooks. Life in the cabin was simple, lonely, but it gave him time to think. And the forest, a sprawling labyrinth of silent trees, beckoned him to roam deeper. That was how he ended up near the creek that morning. He'd needed fresh air to clear his head of memories. Instead, he stumbled on a new, urgent call for help. Standing in the hush of falling snow, Paul crouched by the frozen shepherd and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in ages. Hope, tethered to a fragile sense of responsibility. Paul hurried to the dog's side. Its fur was stiff with ice, and the creature shivered beneath his gloves. Gently, he pressed 2 fingertips beneath a ragged ear, feeling for warmth. The dog's pulse was faint but present, and a low, raspy whine escaped its throat. Something about that sound ignited a fierce determination within Paul. He moved quickly, shrugging off his thick canvas coat. He wrapped it around the shepherd and tried to scoop it up. With a painful whimper, the dog tried to stand on trembling legs. It collapsed into his arms instead, resting its head against his chest as if resigned, or relieved, to surrender to his kindness. Heart pounding, Paul cradled the shepherd, noticing the battered collar around its neck. No tags, only a strange patch of metal that glinted faintly. A low hum of curiosity tugged at his mind, but it was overshadowed by the dog's urgent need for warmth and safety. The trek back to the cabin was grueling. Snow clung to Paul's boots, and an icy wind whipped through the trees. By the time he reached his porch, he was panting, his arms half numb from carrying the heavy dog. He kicked open the door, every muscle protesting, and carefully set the shepherd near the hearth. The dog whimpered again, eyes fluttering open briefly as the heat of the stove began to melt the ice clinging to its fur. Paul scrambled for a blanket, water, anything to help. He knelt by the shepherd, gently stroking its ears, murmuring, "It's okay. You're safe now." Despite the swirl of uncertainties in his life, he felt oddly grounded by the dog's presence. He'd never owned a pet. His ex-wife was allergic, or so she claimed. But in those raw moments as he tried to warm the dog back to life, Paul felt a sudden infusion of purpose. It was as if the forest had guided him to this fragile creature for a reason. Holding a shallow bowl of water to the dog's muzzle, he whispered another reassurance he half hoped was true for himself as well. "I won't let anything hurt you again." That first night, Paul stayed awake in the glow of lamplight to watch over the German shepherd. Snow lashed the windows and gusts rattled the cabin's old rafters, but the heat from the stove gradually thawed the ice trapped in the shepherd's coat. Pools of meltwater soaked the blankets beneath it. Paul used towels and gentle hands to rub warmth back into the dog's limbs, mindful of wincing whimpers whenever he probed too close to a sore spot. Beyond the physical signs of frostbite, the shepherd looked underfed. Ribs protruded beneath its thick fur, and there was a ragged scab along its right flank, as though it had been clawed or cut. Paul's heart panged at the sight. Where had this dog come from? Why was it alone in such a desolate corner of the forest? Every time the shepherd stirred, Paul murmured words of comfort. He didn't know if the dog could understand him, but its gaze, half-lidded and glassy, never wavered from his. When he pressed a plastic syringe of water to its mouth, it drank greedily. The unspoken trust between them, forged in this tempest of ice and fear, felt almost sacred. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion clung to Paul's bones. He'd occasionally close his eyes, only to be jerked awake by the dog's shifting. By morning, the blizzard had calmed. Faint rays of dawn light shone through the windows onto the dog's dark fur. The shepherd attempted to stand, wobbling on shaky legs, and Paul rushed to support it. "You're one tough pup," Paul said, forcing a gentle smile. The dog regarded him with curiosity. Then cautiously it licked his wrist. The unexpected affection caught Paul off guard, and he felt an odd pressure build in his chest, as if relief and sorrow were blending together. He had saved a life. For the first time in months, that knowledge made him feel a glimmer of self-worth. Unsure of how else to help, Paul offered some leftover venison jerky, softened with a bit of warm water. The shepherd devoured it. He checked the dog's collar again, curious about the strange bit of metal embedded in the worn leather. It looked like an old military ID plate, but it was scratched and corroded. All he could make out was a faint stamped imprint. Project Cold Valor, along with a blurred set of numbers. He frowned. Project Cold Valor? The phrase had a military ring to it, but he'd never heard of such a program. Maybe it was some abandoned experimental training? The region did have a few old government sites from the Cold War era, yet something about it felt off, like a relic of a secret best left untouched. Despite the mystery, the dog needed immediate care. Over the next several days, Paul transformed into a self-taught veterinarian. He cleaned the shepherd's wound with boiled water and mild antiseptic, fed it small meals every few hours, and even coaxed it to walk around the cabin to build strength. Each day, the dog improved, gradually putting on weight, its eyes regaining a keen alertness that hinted at intelligence. And with each small victory, Paul found himself opening up in unexpected ways. He talked to the dog. Soon he started calling it Ranger, inspired by the battered collar and the dog's rugged resilience. "Ranger, you want to walk a bit?" he'd say, patting his thigh, and Ranger would hobble over, tail giving a tentative wag. The dog's presence filled the cabin's empty spaces, chasing away Paul's loneliness. During these days of slow, careful nursing, Paul also found himself compelled to revisit old memories he'd tried to bury. He'd talk about his mother, about how she used to sing lullabies in German from her childhood. He told Ranger about the heartbreak of divorce, the loss of friends who didn't know how to handle his grief. While Ranger couldn't offer words of comfort, the steady gaze and gentle companionship were enough to ease the ache in Paul's heart. Yet there was no denying that something about Ranger's origins was strange. Once the dog was mobile again, he'd stare out the window with an intensity that made the hair on Paul's arms prickle. It was as if Ranger expected something, or someone, out there in the snowy expanse. At times, in the dead of night, Paul would awaken to the dog standing by the door, ears perked, as if listening to sounds far beyond human range. Paul's curiosity grew stronger each day. What if Ranger was no ordinary stray? If he'd been part of a military program, how had he ended up abandoned in the middle of the wilderness? Paul couldn't shake the feeling that Ranger's survival was tied to a larger story. Eventually, Paul made a decision that surprised even himself. He would investigate. The forest, though unforgiving, held answers. He kept remembering that half-frozen moment by the creek, the dog's paw pressed into the snow, that silent plea for help. Something had driven Ranger out there in a state of near-fatal exhaustion, and Paul wanted to know what. With fresh determination, he bundled up one cold morning, slipping into his thermal gear. Ranger was still recovering, not quite ready for a full trek, but he'd begun to follow Paul everywhere round the cabin, tail wagging in subtle gratitude. It was time to see where this new path would lead. Paul owed it to Ranger, and maybe to himself, to find out what lay hidden beneath the snowdrifts and the hush of the pines. Before setting off, Paul knelt in front of Ranger, resting a steady hand on the dog's neck. "You changed something in me, buddy," he whispered. "I'm going to make sure no one hurts you again, and I'm going to find out where you came from." Ranger nudged Paul's palm with his muzzle, and in that small gesture, Paul felt a surge of courage. He opened the cabin door, letting the cold air swirl inside, and together they stepped out into the silent, gleaming expanse of white, determined to follow the trail of secrets, waiting deep in the forest. The forest spread before them like an endless cathedral of white and green. Pine boughs weighed down by snow formed a stoic canopy overhead, while the ground crackled beneath Paul's boots. Ranger walked beside him, limping slightly but eager, nose close to the ground, as though hunting a trail only he could sense. Paul aimed to retrace his path to the creek where he'd found Ranger. The morning light fell in speckled patches through the pines, illuminating crystalline flakes that shimmered in the cold air. Breathing steadily, Paul felt a strange blend of apprehension and excitement. He'd spent weeks in these woods alone, but never had his heart raced like this, Perhaps it was the knowledge that he was heading toward something unknown, a piece of Ranger's past that might unravel new truths. They passed ancient birch trees with peeling white bark, and the creek soon came into view, a winding ribbon of ice. It had snowed heavily since Paul had first found Ranger, but fragments of disturbed snow hinted at the spot where the dog had collapsed. The memory flashed in Paul's mind, the limp body, the desperate rescue. Now, Ranger pawed at the frozen bank, ears pricked as though listening for something. Paul hunkered down, rubbing Ranger's shoulders. "You remember this place, don't you?" Ranger let out a quiet whine, his gaze fixed on the opposite side of the creek. There, the land rose in a steep embankment, topped by more towering conifers. Paul hesitated only a moment before crossing a narrow log that lay iced over. With careful steps, he led Ranger across the creek. "Let's see where you came from," he murmured. They climbed the slope, aided by the gnarled roots that acted like footholds. At the top, the forest thinned out, revealing an expanse of snow-draped ground. But as Paul scanned the horizon, he spotted something incongruous, a large metal hatch half buried under the snow. It jutted out from the earth at a slight angle, rimmed with frost. The shape was too deliberate to be a rock or fallen debris. His pulse quickened. Ranger started to whine again, ears flattened. Paul swallowed, stepping closer. The hatch's surface was old, paint flaking off. A faded insignia, a circle with an eagle clutching crossed arrows, was stenciled across the metal. Beneath it, faint words were still legible. U.S. Military Restricted. Paul's breath caught. A military hatch. Out here, something at the edge of his mind recalled rumors about hidden bunkers in northern Minnesota, relics from the Cold War. Some said they were supply caches. Others claimed secret labs. Could Ranger have escaped from whatever was below? With gloved hands, Paul brushed snow off the hatch to reveal a rusted wheel lock. He gave it an experimental tug. The metal groaned in protest but didn't budge. "Should have brought my tools," he muttered, eyeing the seam around the hatch. Then he noticed one side was dented, as if battered from the inside. Had Ranger or something else forced its way out? Ranger barked suddenly, an urgent, echoing sound that startled Paul. The dog's hackles rose. Paul scanned the tree line. Nothing moved except a solitary raven taking flight from a high branch. Yet the sense of being watched snaked down Paul's spine. Perhaps it was just fear of the unknown. He refocused on the hatch. "Let's mark this spot," he decided. "We'll come back with a crowbar, maybe find out what's inside." Despite his trembling hands, curiosity thrummed in his veins. As they retraced their steps toward the cabin, the winter light began to fade. Long shadows stretched across the snow, and a hush settled over the pines. Paul couldn't shake the feeling that this place had been waiting for him, that Ranger's arrival was no coincidence. Project Cold Valor. The words reverberated in his mind, conjuring images of clandestine experiments in an underground facility. Back in the warmth of the cabin, Paul tried to distract himself by preparing dinner, a simple stew. Ranger ate eagerly at his side, but now and then the dog paused, ears twitching as if hearing echoes from deep in the woods. When night fell, Paul booted up his aging laptop. He had no Wi-Fi out here, only a slow satellite phone link, but he attempted a rudimentary search for Project Cold Valor. The signal flickered, and the pages wouldn't load. All he got was an endless buffering symbol and the occasional error message. He gave up, frustration mingling with an odd sense of relief. Perhaps some secrets were better left undisturbed, but the next day he felt compelled to return to the hatch. This time, he brought a crowbar, a hammer, and a coil of rope. Ranger bounded along behind him, tail high, as if his strength had doubled overnight. The moment Paul reached the clearing, an eerie hush settled over the forest. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He kicked aside the fresh snow that had fallen overnight, revealing the metal hatch once more. After jamming the crowbar beneath the dented edge, he struck the end with the hammer. A piercing clang echoed among the trees. Slowly, the hatch groaned open, revealing a dark shaft beneath. Paul peered in, his flashlight illuminating metal rungs bolted to the tunnel's side. A blast of cold, stale air whooshed up, carrying a hint of chemical stench. The top rung looked corroded but intact. Heart-hammering, Paul glanced at Ranger. The dog stared at the opening, ears tipped forward but no longer whining. If Ranger was the reason for this terrifying discovery, then Paul had come too far to turn back now. One rung at a time, he descended. A dozen steps later, his boots hit solid concrete. He swung his flashlight around what appeared to be an underground corridor. The walls dripped with condensation, a testament to decades of ice pressing in overhead. Water pooled in places where the floor had cracked. Old fluorescent light fixtures dangled from the ceiling, dead. Ranger followed, leaping the last few rungs. In the faint beam of the flashlight, Paul saw something that made his stomach lurch. Scratched into the wall were the same words he'd seen on the dog's collar: Project Cold Valor. Below it, a painted sign read, "Authorized personnel only, high clearance required." "What is this place?" Paul breathed, his own voice echoing back at him. Ranger sniffed the concrete floor, tail lowered. Suddenly the dog let out a growl, eyes fixed on a corridor that veered off to the right. Paul flicked the flashlight in that direction, revealing a metal door, partially ajar. He moved slowly, the stale air filling his lungs with each nervous breath. Whatever lay behind that door felt like it could unravel everything he knew, not just about Ranger, but perhaps about the world above. With trembling resolve, Paul slid the door open and stepped into the hidden bowels of an abandoned military lab that time and ice had sealed away from the world. The room beyond the door opened into a larger space, dotted with rows of steel tables, overturned chairs, and shattered glass. Rusted cabinets lined the walls, their doors hanging askew. A rank odor of chemicals and decay assaulted Paul's nostrils. He coughed into the crook of his arm. Ranger walked ahead, sniffing carefully. The dog's tail was rigid, posture alert. Paul's flashlight swept across old monitors piled in a corner, black screens coated in dust. Folders lay strewn across the floor, documents scattered as if people had fled in a hurry. Something crunched beneath his boot, paper brittle with age. He crouched to retrieve a nearby folder marked with the same emblem he'd seen on the hatch. The sheets inside were water-stained, the ink blurred. He could make out snatches of text: accelerated training protocol, cold weather endurance, genetic selection. His mind reeled as he pieced together the fragments. Dogs like Ranger, German shepherds, perhaps others, had been part of a top-secret program. They were bred or trained for extreme conditions, maybe as search and rescue assets or something more sinister. Ranger's growl pulled him from his thoughts. The dog pawed at a tall metal locker near the far wall. Its door hung open, revealing shelves stacked with dusty syringes and vials. One battered binder protruded from the top shelf. It bore the title, Subject Number 9, Ranger. Paul's mouth went dry. Subject Number 019, Ranger. The dog's code name had been official. Heart pounding, Paul flipped through the binder. Inside were lab notes describing rigorous conditioning tests, sub-zero exposure, stamina trials, and ominous references to neurological synchronization. One note stood out. Subject Number 019 exhibits remarkable loyalty, but potential for emotional bonding may compromise mission readiness. The words stirred Paul's anger. Ranger was more than a scientific subject. He was a living being who felt pain, cold, fear, and hope. Whatever they had done here, it was not simple training. He turned the final page to find a photograph, grainy, black and white. It showed Ranger as a young dog standing beside a uniformed downed soldier, muzzle strapped into some contraption. Paul's vision blurred with tears. A sudden noise broke the silence, a loud crack that reverberated through the underground chamber. The ceiling rattled. Paul looked up in alarm. The old structure, weighed down by decades of ice, was giving way. Snowmelt dripped faster, and chunks of concrete shifted overhead. The corridor they'd come through groaned ominously. "Come on, Ranger," Paul shouted, grabbing the binder. They sprinted toward the exit. The hallway shuddered, and a section of the ceiling collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Paul shielded his face. Ranger yelped, darting aside just in time. Clutching the binder, Paul found the ladder. He lifted Ranger first, pushing the dog's hindquarters so the shepherd could grip the rungs with its paws. Then Paul climbed after him, adrenaline surging. Another thunderous rumble shook the base. They scrambled out through the hatch just as the ground lurched. The hatch's rusted wheel jammed, leaving it partially open. Paul stumbled away, falling to his knees, as a roar of shifting debris echoed below. Snow fell in clumps from nearby branches. Ranger barked, breathing hard. For a long moment, Paul just knelt in the snow, chest heaving, heart pounding in his throat. The old lab was collapsing, entombing whatever remained of Project Cold Valor beneath ice and rubble. Ranger whined, nuzzling Paul's shoulder as if to ask, "Are you all right?" Paul hugged the dog fiercely. The binder pressed between them. "We made it," he whispered, voice trembling. The reality of it all crashed in. This was no accident. Ranger had escaped from a place of cruelty, and Paul had nearly been buried along with its secrets. But that near miss crystallized something deep inside him. He could no longer deny that he and Ranger were bonded by fate. In that moment of danger, Paul had discovered a wellspring of courage he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. "I won't run away again," he thought. If Ranger's trust in him had saved the dog's life, then Paul's trust in Ranger had saved his life in return. They stood together under the gray winter sky, changed by what they'd seen below, united by the choice to keep going, together. Later that afternoon, a subdued calm descended over the forest. Paul and Ranger returned to the cabin, exhausted yet somehow exhilarated. After checking Ranger's paws for cuts or bruises, thankfully the dog seemed only shaken. Paul set the binder gently on the kitchen table. A swirl of relief and sorrow coursed through him. He skimmed more of the documents. Though much was unreadable, certain details emerged. The lab had aimed to create canines capable of surviving extreme sub-zero conditions, acting as scouts for classified missions. Ranger, designated subject number 9, showed exceptional empathy, an unintended trait. The last entry mentioned that he was slated for decommission due to excess emotional interference. Paul stared at Ranger, who lay curled by the stove, head resting on his paws. The dog's steady gaze met his, warm and trusting. The notion that any creature's empathy could be deemed a flaw struck him as achingly tragic. Yet, the human world was often unkind to vulnerability. Shutting the binder, Paul gazed out the window at the endless white wilderness. The old lab was gone, sealed beneath collapsing concrete and ice. In its vanishing, it left behind a single survivor. A second chance, Paul thought. For Ranger, yes, but also for himself. The next morning, the sun rose bright over the forest. Paul stepped out onto his porch and found Ranger already waiting, tail wagging. The dog seemed eager for the day, as if the haunting past had loosened its grip. Paul felt a similar stirring within. Rescuing Ranger had rekindled his own sense of purpose. In choosing not to flee from the darkness below, he had proven something to himself. Maybe he wasn't a lost cause after all. He grabbed his coat, beckoning Ranger for a walk. Together, they ventured into the snow, inhaling the crisp, revitalizing air. Now, each crunch of boots and paws was a quiet testament to survival, perseverance, and the power of forging bonds even in life's harshest winters. They paused by the creek, where the ice flowed in delicate swirls beneath transparent surfaces. Paul knelt, placing a hand on Ranger's back. The dog lifted his head toward the sky. In that stillness, Paul felt his mother's memory soften, no longer jagged with pain. He felt the emptiness of the divorce recede, replaced by a new, tangible connection. To Ranger, to these woods, to his own rediscovered resilience. He whispered, "I'm not running anymore." Ranger glanced at him, ears flicking, as if to say he understood. They continued along the creek, leaving footprints side by side in the snow, two survivors forging a path toward a future neither of them had dared to imagine just days before. In the weeks and months that followed, Paul and Ranger built a life together in those winter woods. The binders from the lab remained a reminder of a darker past, but they also became proof of how courage, empathy, and devotion could overcome the coldest odds. Ranger thrived in the forest, chasing squirrels by day and curling up at Paul's feet by night, secure in the knowledge that he was finally safe. Through that bond of trust, Paul learned to open his own heart. The forest no longer felt like a place to hide, but a home where he could heal. And though the secret lab remained buried beneath ice, the tale of Project Cold Valor lived on in the unbreakable loyalty of one rescued German shepherd. If you found hope and wonder in this story, please share it with others who need a reminder that empathy and courage can transform even the coldest corners of our lives. Together, let's celebrate the power of compassion, both in ourselves and in the friends who walk beside us.